the categorical imperative, ethics, and practical reason. You might be wondering why we are looking at Chapter 5 instead of taking Sandel in order. The primary reason is that utilitarianism is perhaps the premier example of a consequentialist ethics and has both an act, that is Bentham, and rule, Mill, variant. While Kant is the prime example of a deontological theory of ethics. If you will recall from Haidt, a deontological ethics is one based on duty. On the other hand, Kant is difficult, and there is something to be said about getting one's feet wet before diving off the deep end. This may be the most difficult chapter to get a handle on. Aristotle would be a distant second. But you are each capable of doing so. Kant is hard in part because while Bentham started with a fresh slate, Kant insisted on addressing philosophical issues that went back hundreds or thousands of years. The other thing about Kant is that his two major works in ethics, the Critique of Practical Reason and the Metaphysics of Morals, to a lesser extent, assume a certain amount of familiarity with his previous and much more difficult work, the Critique of Pure Reason. Nevertheless, we can get some gist of what Kant is after. So, this is what we will be covering: ideas of freedom, duty versus inclination, intelligible versus empirical realms, the categorical imperative, and the kingdom of ends. Kant lived between 1724 and 1804. That puts Kant between the utilitarians Bentham and Mill. If you ever heard the phrases Copernican revolution or having been awakened from one's dogmatic slumber, you have Kant to thank. Kant was born, raised, taught, and died in Königsberg. He never traveled more than 60 miles from Königsberg. One of his students asked whether Kant should propagate his thinking by lecturing across Europe. Kant's response was that if anyone was interested, they knew where he lectured and was free to go. Kant was also known for being an individual of set and firm limits. In many ways, he lived the ethics he advocated. Hume's guillotine. Around the time of Bentham, there was another British philosopher, Scottish to be precise, David Hume. Hume also had a theory of moral philosophy, but he also had a critique of the assumptions that most philosophers, including Bentham, made. Bentham wanted to establish ethical principles based on empirical, measurable facts. Hume argued that there was a world of difference between empirical and moral judgments. Statements of facts, that is statements, describe things as they are, not how they ought to be. Ought statements are statements of value and don't belong to the things themselves, but are imposed upon them by our judgment. Hume's guillotine can be summarized as one cannot derive an ought from an is. Kant took this observation to heart. Kant simply points out that the utilitarian never asks whether a given pleasure is worthwhile, that is, of any moral worth. It is one's intentions that are the mark of moral character. Inclinations fare no better. Let's say that you and a roommate have a choice between going to a movie or a lyceum, which just happens to be the North Carolina Symphony. Your roommate is set on the lyceum. You don't like classical music. Frankly, you've heard more than you care for in this class, but you want to hang out with your roommate, and you need the credit. If you are Bentham, the movie might win hands down unless the pleasure of hanging out plus getting the lyceum credits outweigh the suffering you have to do from yet another encounter with Beethoven. But Kant would ask whether That is really being free. Haven't all you've done is to allow your inclinations to dictate your choice for you? In that case, you are simply following your inclinations and you are no more free than a bowling ball is going down a lane obeying the laws of physics. At a minimum, for Kant, freedom is a matter of choosing what you want. These are examples of acting heteronomically, that is, from an outside law. For an act to be of moral worth, it must be freely performed. Freedom, far more than being a moral side note, is absolutely crucial to ethics. It is the free intention of an individual that makes an act good or bad. So, Bentham doesn't fare so well with Kant, but Kant isn't going to let Hume off either. Hume concluded that the reasons we give for the way we act are more like rationalizations than actual rational justifications. He would conclude that we are guided by our inclinations and invent reasons after the fact, that we impose moral value to do something that he calls moral sentiment. As we've already seen, Kant sees inclinations as being just another is statement. So Kant is pulling ought out of thin air and so commits the very error he accuses others of trying to derive an ought from an is. If that is the case, what we are left is reason. Reason is prior to the things that we experience, our inclinations, our calculations of facts. It is the only basis of which reason is that we act autonomously. That is to say, the only basis for acting morally is the reasons where we act autonomously. Therefore, if we act autonomously, acting from a law within ourselves, we act freely. If we act not according to what we want, but what we choose to want, we are acting autonomously. So on what basis do we choose? Kant's answer is that we are essentially rational beings. As rational beings, we are able to develop laws of pure reason. Since these laws would be those of how we ought to act, Kant calls these laws of pure practical reason. Since they come from within ourselves, acting according to these laws would be acting autonomously. So then, moral, praiseworthy actions are those where we choose to follow the moral law. The idea of freedom is central to Kant because we are responsible for our actions insofar as we choose those actions. If all actions are determined by law of cause and effect, then so are our choices. If our choices are determined, we are not free to choose otherwise, and so cannot be held responsible. Kant makes a distinction between the sensible world, the phenomenal world, that is, of things that as we experience them, and the noumenal world, that is, things as they are in themselves. Because we can only know the world insofar as we experience it within the structure of pure reason, our only knowledge is of the phenomenal world. That is, our knowledge of what there is and what can be is a combination of pure reason and experience. Experience is structured by reason in categories, that is, unchanging universals. For instance, we experience things in time and space, but we do not experience space and time in themselves. This is the sensible world, and we are creatures in it. As we have already seen, the way things are and can be do not tell us how things ought to be. These lie outside of experience, and so must be guided by pure reason. Moreover, the phenomenal world is deterministic, so that nothing within it is free or can be morally praiseworthy. If we go back, we can see that acting according to our inclinations is not acting freely. Because oughtness deals with actions, the reason is practical. Hence, pure practical reason. This also means that we are noumenal creatures. Incidentally, The world of reason is one in which we can choose regardless of inclination. Here's the deal. Reason is categorical, that is to say, universal. Since pure reason is categorical, so must pure practical reason. Kant makes a distinction between hypothetical imperatives, that is, those that follow an if-then structure. For instance, if I want to graduate, then I must finish my coursework, and categorical imperatives that are in no way conditioned by any given happenstance. For instance, thou shalt do no murder, and holds true in all times and places. Moreover, the imperative must be the expression of a good will. Intentions are key here. Part of a good will is to act out of good intentions in accordance with the moral law for its own sake, not for one's inclinations, because morally praiseworthy acts are done autonomously. Or for that matter, it can't be because of consequences. At this point, you might be asking how Kant avoids Bentham's charge against Locke that any talk of universal principles being so much nonsense on stilts. The answer is that Bentham took it for granted that all knowledge is empirical, that it is drawn from experience and nothing else. Kant argued extensively in the Critique of Pure Reason that this is not the case. A reasonable question then would be, just what are these universal maxims, and what makes for a categorical imperative? Kant provides two examples. Act only on that maxim, that is, rule, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, and act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your person or in the person of any other, simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. The first we have already reviewed. The key to the second imperative is that a person possesses reason and so acts autonomously, that is, as ends for themselves. In addition, the idea of humanity is universal, of which you and I are particular instances. As such, persons possess a distinct dignity. Now, looking at Sandel, pages 121 and following, ask yourself these questions. Try rephrasing the second imperative. How is this different than the golden rule? And what are some concrete examples?